Hey there, everybody. I am going to be making a series of videos for world history to keep us on track with where we need to be. We kind of left off at the beginning of chapter 18, all about the Industrial Revolution. And so I'm just going to keep going with those. So there'll be this video for the second part and then a final video wrapping up chapter 18. So I hope you all are doing well, being at home and kind of away from your friends here at school, and just adjusting to life looking drastically different. It's very strange sitting here in the classroom all by myself as I look out there. Um, it's just different teaching to a room with nobody else. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and dive on into our notes for this. If you have any questions or concerns or anything I can help you with, again, feel free to reach out to me via email, and I'll keep posting what we need to be working on and all that information in Google Classroom. So it's important for you to check Google Classroom every day, to complete the bell ringer that's in Google Classroom every day during these days that we are apart. That is how teachers will be taking attendance, is to see that you have completed it during that day. So anyway, let me know if you have any questions or if something's not quite clear. We are here to help and make this as seamless as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with y'all and bring up the slides for this next part of our notes. So after chapter 18, section 2, for those of you that like to have page numbers in your book to kind of follow along, I am starting on page 405 with basically responses to this revolution. So what were some of the reforms and things that come out of this? So let's look at our main goals here. First of all, what is reform? So we'll be looking at that. And then what are the social and political reforms and laws that are passed by the British government during this time? So reform. Great Britain was a leader in industrial production, as we were talking about last week, with all those new innovations and taking things and instead of making them at home with your cottage industry, moving them into a factory and making them on a much larger scale. England was also known for trying to fix social and political problems created by this rapid expansion. And we have all these people moving into the cities. Instead of being a rural community, all of a sudden we're an urban community. And with that comes issues of sanitation and living conditions and all sorts of things to try to navigate and figure out. So a simple definition of reform is that it implies a change for the better. Okay? So making something better than it was previously. All right, let's go back to that for just a second. I know some of you are trying to take notes, hopefully. And hey, feel free to pause along the way if you need to. So Parliament, okay, that British governing body, kind of like our Congress here in the United States, was really sincere in their efforts to fix some of these abuses in these different industries. But one thing that they weren't really thinking about at the time is that increased government involvement can easily lead to government control. So let's talk about some of these things that they were looking at. Social reform. Again, I'm on page 405, so if I'm kind of glancing over, looking at the book here. So some of the earliest legislation came in the 1830s. Okay, Parliament passed their first Factory Act, and that basically limited child labor. According to this law, no child under 9 years of age had to work in a textile mill. And so kind of a cool thing that we don't have little 4 and 5-year-olds running around and getting injured. The Poor Law from 1834 put the government in charge of caring for those that were too elderly or too sickly to work. So that kind of provided some relief for people who had been injured or just weren't able to get up and go to work anymore. In 1842, they passed the Mines Act, and that limited women and children from 10 years and under working in the mines. Okay. In a further effort to regulate working hours, Parliament passed the 10-hour bill, okay, and that was in 1847. And this limited women and children to only working 10 hours a day in whichever industry they were talking about. So whether that was the mining industry or textile industry in the factories, that was the limit. Okay, so taking things a step further, and there were a lot of humanitarian efforts that came out of this time period, and a key figure during this time was a guy by the name of William Wilberforce. Now, some of you might recognize the picture down there at the bottom. There was a movie made quite a few years ago called Amazing Grace, kind of telling his story of what he went through. So he was a sincere Christian, kind of motivated by his faith to do something about this slavery issue. So in 1807, the British Parliament abolished the slave trade in British territories. Okay. So that was a pretty cool first step. But in 1833, so a couple decades later, Parliament voted to begin this process of freeing all the slaves throughout the British Empire. So there's a cool scene in the movie where Wilberforce brings in these petitions and he flings out this roll of paper, and it just goes all the way down with all these signatures of people that are supporting him. So if you haven't watched that movie, it's worth checking out for those of you that enjoy those kind of historical things. All right, let's keep moving here. So when it comes to economic reform, we've looked at a little bit of social reform. So when it comes to people's jobs, people's money, in 1846, Parliament repealed the Corn Laws. Okay, those laws had placed a very high tariff on imported grain that was coming into the country. So those tariffs basically limited foreign competition and allowed the British landowners to sell their grain at vastly inflated prices. So the repeal of these laws helped to bring down the price of grain and helped alleviate financial burden on a lot of the workers who had to pay these high prices just in order to feed their families. All right, when it comes to political reform, so we've looked at social, economic, and then political. So political reform includes the Reform Bill of 1832, which lowered the property qualifications for voting. So instead of having to be that like upper top class, middle class people were now allowed to vote. The king was a little unhappy, but it did end up getting passed in 1832 and became law. Okay. The Reform Bill of 1867 lowered property qualifications even further and allowed the working class to vote. Okay. So kind of a big deal. There was a group of people that started a movement in England during this time called the Chartists. And they basically advocated universal suffrage for everybody, and kind of a cool thing that they were up to. They presented several different petitions. Parliament oftentimes refused to act, but its demands eventually became law in Britain. It just took a little longer than they anticipated. So two key players in this whole time of reform were the prime ministers of England. And so they are kind of those key political figures, worked closely with the queen or king at the time, and really made a difference in some drastically different ways here. So our first guy up there at the top is a guy by the name of Benjamin Disraeli. Okay. He was the prime minister and mainly worked in the relationship of England with other countries. So very involved in foreign affairs. helped pass some of these reform bills, and he focused a lot on just making England a better place. Okay? Our next gentleman here, William Gladstone, was also a prime minister, a very religious man whose beliefs helped shape his political life. And he really focused on what was going on at home, helping to make the lives of the English people better. He worked a lot with bills related to public health, public housing. So both of these men played a big role in England during this time of reform. Gladstone also was a big supporter of making sure people had access to education. So that is the end of our slides for today. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. So again, if you have questions, comments, concerns, feel free to reach out via email. Again, keep checking Google Classroom, and there should be an assignment in there waiting for you related to reform and what the Bible has to say about all of that. So have a good day, and I'll see you guys later.